BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests.
By now, the conclusions of the scathing Justice Department report on the Baltimore City Police Department are well known. It's a litany of illegal and unconstitutional tactics that unlawfully target African Americans, which comes as little surprise to the people of the city who have been fighting for police reform for decades.
The evidence and the data was there 12, 13, 14 years ago about the number of arrests, the number of persons that were being arrested without being charged.
And that lack of surprise is what defines for many people the tenor of the conversation about reform today.
If you have civilians involved in every part of the process, people outside the context of policing, then it creates a context where officers wouldn't be able to get away with the things that are mentioned in the DOJ report.
All that was able to happen because a Maryland State Senator got arrested.
Clarence Mitchell IV tells the story of how the first step in the effort to reform police, the Civilian Review Board, was initiated after the brutal arrest of a state senator in 1999.
The officer comes over to her without even talking to her really and says, "If you don't leave now, I'm arresting you." At that point, Joan doesn't say, "I'm Senator Conway." She said she didn't do that for a reason. She said, "How can you arrest me when I'm asking questions?" At that point, the officer not only arrests her, sits her on the ground. State Senator Joan Carter Conway handcuffs her, sits her on the ground. They take her down to central booking.
Mitchell, who was a senator at the time, was outraged over her treatment, which helped prompt the approval of the bill. But Mitchell says his sense of accomplishment was short-lived.
They allowed the subpoena power basically to expire because they had a sunset provision on the subpoena power. They then never made us a recommendation for funding for investigators. So there were a lot of things needed to happen after 2000, after it became official in 2000, that didn't happen. So.
Next was a movement to change the department from within.
What we did, we initiated, we went around and got ad hoc groups of some of the leading experts in the city and state to devise and develop a plan specifically for Baltimore City.
Sergeant Lewis Hobson, who filed and won a landmark civil rights lawsuit against the department over discrimination against black officers, touted the People's Plan around the same time. A comprehensive overhaul of policing he proposed just as the city embarked on its now notorious zero-tolerance strategy of mass arrests.
There was a core group that had studied this problem and said, no, you don't want to bring zero tolerance in because we were afraid that it would lead to the problems that we now see 20 years later that we're having.
Fast forward to 2010, when State Delegate Jill Carter began introducing an ambitious array of legislation to fix what the Justice Department defined as the BPD's biggest problem. The department's emphasis on numbers instead of good policing, and the unconstitutional policies which resulted from this misguided emphasis. But she too met resistance.
The very obstacle was the leadership of the Maryland General Assembly, the leadership of the mayor's office, and pretty much the establishment, the Democrat leadership establishment.
It was only the uprising after the death of Freddie Gray that spurred legislators in Annapolis to act. And one of the key measures to emerge, a law that would allow civilians on internal trial boards, was changed at the last minute to give the police union the final say. An ongoing roadblock to reform, David Rocha of the ACLU says continues to influence efforts in the state capitol.
The FOP is a huge impediment to reform. Whether reform is possible without their support depends on whether legislators are willing to be accountable to the constituents that they're supposed to serve, or the FOP that is working on their political campaigns and making political campaign contributions.
Which is why all agrees the efforts of reform must continue, with a focus on a single underlying premise: civilian oversight and control.
I truly believe, after studying and reviewing this process for so long, that the people have the power. They know what's best and how best to govern themselves.
This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network.